You can have better game, you can be cooler, you can actually be better overall, but you're not going to win every specific comparison. So the more specific comparisons like that you can avoid losing at, the better off you are. Next question is one you will definitely run into as you start going on more and more dates. It reads, I've been on a few Tinder dates recently and the girls' past relationships have come up. Usually they talk about the negatives. I was wondering if you could explain the dynamics of this type of conversation. Would this be her qualifying me or something else? And what is the best way to use this situation for my benefit, as I feel like I could be taking advantage of it, but I'm unsure of where to go with it. And this is from initials ZG. So thank you, initials ZG. All right, so this is a really interesting question, and I'm gonna take what he used, but I'm gonna broaden it a little bit more, at least to start, which is just how do you deal with the conversation about past dating in general, right? Because it's gonna come up in both ways. He's talking specifically about the girl talking about her past relationships, but usually if the girl's talking about her past relationships, you're also gonna end up talking about your past relationships. That's how conversations go, right? They're mutual, they go back and forth. So you should expect that if she talks about hers, she's going to ask about yours or expect you to talk about yours or something like that. First thing I want to say is that I do not like these conversations. I do not try and engage in these type of conversations. And the reason why I don't like them is that there's a very high risk of doing something specifically wrong that will be a turnoff. And there's a relatively low possibility of knocking it out of the park and massively changing her opinion of you in a positive way. So these types of conversations I consider to be sort of like minefields. And since I don't like stepping on landmines, I walk around the minefield as opposed to through it. And so typically if a girl starts, first of all, I don't ask girls about their past relationships. I really try and avoid that. And we can get into some of the reasons why not and the things that can go bad with that in a second. But also I don't want to be asked about my past relationships because again, there's a lot that can go wrong. Specifically, one of the major things I want to avoid is I don't like being asked how many girls I slept with. That's not a good question. No matter what your number is, that's a loaded question. Right? If your number is too low, you look lame. If your number is too high, you look like, some kind of like super player or like kind of sleazy, or maybe she'll think you have like 10 STDs or something like that, right? So you got to be very careful with that. And if your number is somewhere in the middle, well, okay, fine, it's probably safe and good, but how do you know what's in the middle to her? Maybe 3 is a lot to her, maybe 20 is a lot to her. Maybe 20 is very few to her, maybe 50 is a lot to her. How do you know? How do you know what number's low or high to her, and how do you know if you're in the middle? And then if you are in the middle, it's not like she's gonna be like, oh, good, he's in the middle, I love him now. She'll be like, okay, cool, that didn't like rule him out. That's the best you're gonna do with this answer, is not rule yourself out. And the worst you're gonna do is rule yourself out. So what's the point of getting into this kind of conversation? In general, if you do get into this kind of conversation, I like to keep it very, very vague. So at first I might just like ignore the question and go on if there's other topics around it and just not even answer it. Maybe she'll say, I'll be like, oh my goodness, that's so cute. You're like, I'm not even there with you. Like, let's just be friends first before we get into the whole sex thing, right? So you maybe do a disqualify or something like that can absolutely work. Another answer, I gave an answer in another video recently where I said something about like, it's not as high as you might think. I know I come off a little bit playerish. It's not like 6-digit number or some crazy thing like that, okay? So you kind of exaggerate what it's not, and obviously it's not. Six digits would be in the hundreds of thousands. You'd be like Genghis Khan level at that point. So obviously like it's not that, but just by exaggerating it, you're kind of making the point. And then you can say I have high standards, or I like to connect with people, or you can say, I've tended to have, some of my relationships actually last. They're not all one night stands, so it's not like I'm running it up as quickly as you might be imagining right now looking at how attractive I am. All right, so you can say those kind of answers if you like to. The other way that I will go sometimes is I'll say like I stopped counting at whatever, or I guess I stopped counting pretty early on. Like once maybe if I'm in the hundreds and hundreds now, maybe I'll say like, I stopped counting at like around, I don't know, like 18, 20, something like that. Because at that point it's just like, who cares, right? It's like you're sexually active and you're meeting people, and it's really a lot more about like the connection and who you're meeting and whether you like that person, right, than the number. So I really like honestly couldn't even give a number. Right. In any case, I like to keep vagueness around questions like that because, again, it's very easy to have the wrong specific answer, whereas vagueness gives you a much wider kind of bound for error in terms of all that. And the same kind of applies, to a lesser degree to all these different relationship questions. Like, let's talk about if you're talking about your ex-girlfriends. It's a minefield. right? If you seem to be too negative about them, well, they assume you have negative relationships and they don't want to end up in a relationship with you. And they don't want to be that next ex that you're like talking shit about. And also if you're talking shit about them, well, then would they be talking shit about you back? Or, does this reflect on how you view people? Are you a bad friend? Are you unreliable? There's all kinds of things that can come out of shit talking your exes. On the other hand, if you're too positive about your exes, well, now it's going to seem like maybe you still have a crush on them, or maybe you're still hung up on them, or maybe they all broke up with you and you're still longing for them, or who knows, right? So just avoid these things as much as possible. And rather than specifically asking questions that are going to lead to them, avoid those questions, avoid those conversational topics. At least that's my strategy. Now, I will say that's not everybody's strategy, right? I have a client who I'm working with for his online game, and to be fair, all of his game, and he does really, really well. Like he's going on multiple dates a week right now, and he's actually a really fun client because we're dealing with these very high level things, and he like gets it, right? So as soon as I'm like explaining a really advanced concept, and halfway through he's like, oh, I get it, that makes total sense. Why didn't I think of that? And I'm like, yes, this is so much fun. I love coaching him. But anyway, it's funny because I did a thing where he recorded his date, and I was listening to the date, and he specifically does go into that on almost all of his dates. And I actually kind of advised him the pros and cons of it. I said he might not want to all the time. But the point is, whether or not I don't think it's the thing making his dates work by any stretch. He's doing a lot of other things right. But the point is, he's been successful over, I think we've been working together for maybe almost like 6 months now. He's been very successful throughout that whole period and increased in success during that period as well, in spite of or along with talking about dating history and talking about how many dates the girl's going on. So it's absolutely not something it's not something you can't get past. He obviously is killing it while doing it. So it's not an absolute must. It's not a total deal breaker. It's just a strategic preference on my end. What do you do if you do like bringing this up? Or what do you do if the girl just tries to bring it up and you just can't avoid it? What should you do? Well, I'll tell you some of the things I don't like with respect to the girl talking about her exes. So what I don't like is I don't like the girl talking about the good things her exes did that are things that you're absolutely not going to do. Because that's setting up this sort of like parameter for what she considers a good relationship. And again, it's this very specific parameter that you're very specifically going to fail, right? And whether it's actually failing or not in the real world, it's become framed as failing because she set it up as overtly what she's looking for. So that's a big problem. And then it also obviously like you're not going to, assuming she's, dated high value guys, you're not going to beat them in every respect, right? The type of girls that I date have dated guys like NFL quarterbacks and have dated guys like hedge fund billionaires and things like that, right? And so you're not going to compete with these guys on all levels. They're going to be more famous than you or more rich than you or be able to travel and have a better lifestyle or take her to nicer restaurants than you can. And you don't want to get into that direct comparison because you're not going to win on every level. You're just not. You can have better game. You can be cooler. You can actually be better overall, but you're not going to win every specific comparison. So the more specific comparisons like that you can avoid losing at, the better off you are. Okay, it's sort of like your maximum potential until you've defined it and pinned it down is essentially infinite. As soon as you start pinning it down in various ways, you start limiting your maximum potential, and the girl starts losing this like dreamy, Prince Charming, amazing, best man in the world view of your potential and your possibility. So I like to avoid that as much as possible. If a girl is talking about her exes and stuff like that, if she seems to go down that road a lot, what can you do? Well, one thing you can do is make it into teases, right? Kind of lighthearted teases, giving her shit about it, that kind of stuff. And you can exaggerate it, make it silly, make it a lot less tangible and a lot less specific. So focus on the generalities, focus on the patterns, focus on the teases within it, as opposed to a lot of specific in the weeds facts. So that's kind of number one. The other thing you can do is you can go tangential, right? So since in the first place, I like avoiding this conversation. If I do end up in this conversation, she starts down this road, I'm going to respond to it, and then I'm going to respond to it in a way that pushes it to a conversation topic I'd rather talk about so that we don't end up having the whole conversation about something I didn't want to talk about. So that's another thing is if you're on it, get off of it. With respect to when you are asked specifically about your own dating history, and if she is being very specific about it, there are a few opportunities in it. Again, on net, I don't think it's really worth getting into, at least usually not in a specific way. Like you don't want to talk about, there was this one specific ex I dated and she was X, Y, and Z and she was this old and we lived in this and she liked to do this sexual position. No, don't get into that shit, okay? But what you can do occasionally is, this you might actually even bring up intentionally. If you notice within how the girl is kind of portraying herself that there's going to be an objection from her in the future. For example, if the girl seems to be extremely like good girl by the book, I have my rules, I don't kiss on the first date. If she seems to be that kind of a girl, Well, an interesting thing you can do is in a general and vague way, not about a specific girl, at least at first, and you'd like to avoid ever getting super specific, but you can talk about how in the past you had girlfriends who were that way at first. Once they were able to like get rid of all that inhibition and holding back and stuff like that, they ended up having so much more fun and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And you can give that kind of a general answer. Now, you don't want to do that right after a girl says something because then it seems reactive. So if the girl says like, oh, I'm a good girl, I don't kiss on the first date, you don't be like, well, I had a lot of girlfriends in the past who didn't kiss on the first date and they found that this. Now you're in a fight with her, right? What you want to do is you're going to be like, oh, that's really interesting. Maybe tease her about it, maybe over-exaggerate it, whatever. And then maybe 5 minutes later, when you're on a different topic, you bring up a story about an ex-girlfriend or a story about, a general pattern in your dating or something like that, that then says this thing. But it has to be detached enough from the girl's objection that it doesn't look like a direct response. It doesn't look reactive in nature. That's very, very important with this. The other thing you can do as you start learning Blueprint, as you start reading the way that girls interact in general, if the girl is X, she's probably also Y, Z, A, B, and C, right? So if the girl is the girl who's by the book in this regard, she's probably this, 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 and this. And so what you can end up doing is you can end up telling stories that are sort of the objection handlers for those other objections you notice are in her behavior pattern before they come up. Because if you do it before it comes up, it can't be reactive, right? If you do it after it comes up, it's reactive. You do it before it comes up, it's just something you said. And now she's forced to follow your frame and kind of walk your minefield instead. And actually, that's the way that you want to set this up if you are in these kind of conversations, is you want to be the one who's planting the mines in the minefield rather than one walking through it. So during these kind of conversations, actually, I was going to say the more you can have her talking, and that's awful. You don't want that because the girl talking is very unpredictable and it can go a lot of different directions. So that's not what you want. You don't want to like have her walking through the minefield in the sense of being the one talking and talking and talking about her exes. That's bad. Don't do that. What you want to do though is you want to set the minds by leading the direction of the conversation, and then you can be talking, she can be talking, whatever. But you want to be the one that's choosing the topics, choosing the questions, choosing the nature of the questions, and you want to be keeping it vague and on useful topics. So rather than getting into something like a specific how many sexual partners have you had, you could get into something like vague, like are you a fairly passionate person? It's similar, it's related. A person who's fairly passionate, especially fairly sexually passionate, it's equated to having a lot of sexual partners. If you are very sexually passionate, you probably have had more sexual partners. It's not always, but it's likely. There's a correlation, but it's not this direct, factual, numerical, comparative, very like unquestionable thing. All right. So what you want to do is you want to lead with stuff that's more vague. You want to lead with stuff that's framed the right way. You want to lead with stuff that's framed along the lines of your exes and your past history being something to aspire to. Like if she could be in the category of these other girls, that would be a positive thing. Stuff along those lines is really, really useful. And then when you're posed very direct, very minefieldy questions, you would like to answer them vaguely, briefly, and onto a better frame and a better topic as much as possible. So in general, mostly you should avoid these topics. However, there are a few situations where it can be good, and mainly the situations where it can be useful are the situations where you sense some sort of objection and you can use past examples or you can use a story of some kind or whatever to handle an objection before it comes up. If you see that opportunity, then as much as talking about exes is not a good thing, it's better than talking directly about the relationship with her. As one of the cardinal rules in game is don't talk about game in progress. Another cardinal rule is it should feel like it just happened. So if you bring up some random topic about an ex and that happens to make the point as sort of a parable, that's better than directly addressing it to this girl. So that is one situation where talking about your past history can be good. But again, you want to keep it vague as much as possible rather than specific. You don't want to talk about a specific girl. You don't want to get into the nature of she was 5'2" and blonde and this and that and the other, right? You want to be vague, positive, and proactive when these kind of things are coming up.